A collection of ghost stories. Volume 1. A novel by Neil Wesson. Chapter 3. The Search for Melton Top. The two sexagenarians greeted each other with a handshake. They hadn't seen one another for, what was it now, 25 years? Much had changed here over the past 40 years since they had last stood on this spot. The location for this reunion was Hessel foreshore looking out across the Humber estuary. Much had changed over the years. The most obvious development in that time had to be the single-span suspension bridge which stretched out across the river linking East Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. Many other things had changed in this part of the county since two young men had trodden the footpaths and byways that collectively form the Wolds Way. It was 40 years ago that the two old friends had walked the 80 or so miles of the Wolds Way together, and now they were about to embark on part of that journey again. Their respective bodies had passed the point of fitness to complete the full journey long ago, but they had to do this last part once more. The stretch between the villages of Hessel and Melton would be re-walked, this time in reverse to their first attempt. Ian and Neil had been at school together, then trained together as engineers. The war had come along and, like all the men of their age, been sent overseas to fight the ensuing threat posed by the forces of tyranny. They served together in Burma, both were captured and held in the same POW camp. After the war they were shipped home. After 3 years in the tropical jungle they wanted to see the rolling hills of England again, and were better than at home Yorkshire. So before returning to their everyday jobs they decided to walk the Wolds Way. Setting off from Filey it took them a week to get close to home. As they passed the village of Welton it was starting to get dark. With only 3 or 4 miles to go they wanted to push on and finish it. As they reached the wood at Melton Top the warm inviting glow of a pub shone out into the darkness. In the dark it was not easy to make out what it looked like, but it had 2 stories and at least 10 windows on the upper level. "Come on, let's get a drink," Neil said enthusiastically. "Well, I suppose it's too dark to carry on," Ian replied. No need for any coaxing there. The two young men made for the door. Neil pushed it open in eager anticipation of a sit-down and a pint. The door was made up of 3 panels of roughly sworn wood. It was difficult to see, but in the darkness he could see no sign of a lock. "Strange," he said to himself as they entered. As the interior became visible to them their faces dropped in disbelief. "Are you up for this?" Ian asked Neil. He had always been the fitter of the two. Both were keen sportsmen in their youth, with Ian always having the slight advantage over his friend in the more physical disciplines, whereas Neil had the edge over him in games requiring dexterity and skill. "I don't know, we'll have to see. Should be though, we've walked a lot further. We were a lot younger then though." "That's true. Come on then." Ian led the way, walking off up the foreshore. Leaving the monument marking the finishing point of the Wolds Way behind them the two old men set off to find the place they sought. It had been the topic of conversation many times over the years, but neither of them had ever returned to that place. The two engineers stopped for a moment directly under the Humber Bridge. They stood and looked up in awe. "Now that's what I call proper engineering," Neil commented, looking up at the North Tower. "Bit bigger than anything we ever knocked up." You would know, you did bigger projects than I ever did." Ian had stayed in engineering all his working life. Neil, however, had become a writer a few years after the war. The conflict had left a profound effect on his life, and he had published many books based on his own and his friends' experiences. 1 mile further upriver the footpath turned away from the waterfront and headed uphill and inland. The path was still lined by a bank of trees on either side, but now houses were built almost up to the edge of one side of the path. The sun shone through the branches, causing a strange temperature change as they walked through shade to light. At the top of this part of the track the unmistakable sound of heavy traffic greeted them. In 1948 there was no road here, only a farm track. Now the only safe way across the busy A63 was via a steel footbridge a quarter of a mile down the road. Neil entered the public house first, followed closely by Ian. "Oh my God," Ian whispered into Neil's right ear. It was the first time ever he had ever heard his friend use the Almighty's name in vain, or as a matter of fact with any type of reference. The room was nothing like any public house either of the two of them had ever been in. No pictures advertising brewers' products adorned the wall. No horse brasses lashed to leather straps, even the bar was wrong. No pumps, no logos. As the two 20-somethings walked up the bar all heads turned to view them. Who were these two young men with their strange clothes and bags on their backs? Neil was the first to the bar. Behind it lay 4 large wooden barrels lying on their side, all had a tap fitted to the front end, and a spile wedged in the top. Ian stood closely behind Neil, and was taking a good look around the bar. Most pubs these days had mirrors behind the bar, but not this one, he observed. Looking round it was clear to him that this pub needed bringing into the mid-20th century. No electric lights were to be seen anywhere in this establishment, or for that matter any gas light fittings. He supposed that it was quite possible The pub was high on the hill, miles away from the nearest village. Maybe electric hadn't made it as far out, maybe the supply had been bombed and not yet reconnected. It is a little-known fact that Hull and the surrounding area were heavily bombed by the Luftwaffe emptying their cargo on the way back to Germany. The room was illuminated by candlelight only. Behind each flickering lone flame was a polished metal plate, the sort of thing that was done in the Middle Ages. Ian turned his attention to one of the customers in the bar. It looked as though they had made their own cloths. Being from the city and put this down to country living, he knew no better. 2 pints of bitter, please, asked Neil in a cheery voice. The thick-set barman looked up with a disagreeable look on his rough face. Pints, he grunted. The barman, who was the landlord, was more of an ogre than man. His hands were covered in warts, his face was red and blotchy, almost like a plague victim. The towel he carried over his shoulder could only be described as a rag the color of reddish earth. Jugs, you mean? Yes, jugs, Neil replied, not wanting to incur the wrath of this man. The landlord put 2 mugs down on the bar. They looked homemade, rough and irregular in shape. That summed up this place in Ian's eyes, rough and very irregular. From under the bar his wart-ridden hand took a large jug which was in a similar style to the mugs. He turned and filled it from one of the barrels. Once full he slammed it down on the bar, beer slopping over the sides. Quarter. Neil looked at Ian, who returned his blank look. Sorry? Quarter, he repeated. From his pocket, Neil took a handful of coins. I don't have a quarter of that one. The landlord pointed at the 1-penny piece in his hand. For a jug of beer Neil gladly handed the penny over. The 2 walkers sat down in the corner out of the way. Once seated, the locals returned to their drinks and conversations. What's going on here? Neil's voice was full of excitement. I don't know, it's like a throwback to the Middle Ages. I know, fantastic isn't it? No it isn't. We drink up then go. Ian had a feeling that all was not right here. What, he only wanted a quarter of a penny for a jug of ale. We've got 3 left in the barrel. The conversation levels around the room dropped to a whisper as the locals intently watched the 2 newcomers. No one knew had come here for years. You too? Shouted the landlord, who remained standing behind the bar. Where are you from? Is he talking to us? Ian asked. I think so, best answer him. If not we might not out of here alive. Hull, he answered. Hull? What, the river? Is that why you wear such strange clothes? No, not the river, the city around it. Oh, Wyke, added a man sitting in the shadows somewhere to the right of the bar. Wyke. The word echoed around the bar, everyone saying the word at least once, followed by a hum of recognition. Neil was something of an historian, and knew that before Hull had been granted the King's Charter almost 800 years ago the town was called Wyke. Before Ian could answer, Neil butted in. Yes, that's right. You're not local then? Asked a voice. It could have emanated from anywhere from in the mass of bodies hidden in the dark corners. This is freaking me out, Ian said in a hushed, worried tone. Don't worry. These people are just a bit different from us, it's their way. I don't fancy stopping here tonight. We can't go on tonight. The footpath in both directions goes through the wood, we wouldn't stand a chance. If we tried walking tonight we could end up in the quarry. Anyway, it's not that bad here. The beer was starting to take effect on him. It always hit Neil first. Ian's tolerance was a little higher. Maybe Neil was right. After all, they would be under cover here and warm. The landlord was speaking to what they took for his wife. She was just about as ugly as he was. Were they talking about them, or was it just their paranoia? The women disappeared into the back room. Her instructions had been given. Are you 2 gentlemen having another jug? Asked the landlord. This time his voice was calm and friendlier. Yes. The boys replied almost simultaneously. They didn't know which was worse, the landlord being friendly or offensive. Neil began to stand to make the trip to the bar. No. I'll bring it over yonder. Once full, the landlord brought the jug of beer over. The brew was not the normal type of ale the boys were used to. It was very watery, and not the remotest sign of a head on it. It did though have the desired effect on the senses that all good liquor should have. After the second jug, Ian and Neil's apprehensions had disappeared, and they were quite enjoying themselves, even conversing with some of the locals. It may have been the effect of the beer, but no one in the pub seemed to know anything of modern-day life. The war had not been mentioned. Entering any public place, especially a pub, the talk was of nothing else. Were the locals enjoying a joke at the expense of the 2 visitors who had so recently arrived in the pub? Will you be staying the night? Asked the landlord. I think we may have to, Neil said with a smile on his face. This could turn out to be a good night after all. You'll have to share. That'll be fine. Neil laughed. I'm sure we can be trusted with each other. Ian joined in the joke, laughing loudly. The whole pub also appeared to in on the joke as a ripple of laughter circled the pub. Suddenly the atmosphere changed as the door blew open, blowing all the straw lining the floor across the room, forming a pile against the bar. One of the regulars jumped up and closed the door. As it shut, the merriment continued. The last jugs of beer was finished and taken away, only the dregs remained and the 2 mugs sat on the table. Most of the locals had left now, curiously passing comments such as "have a good night and enjoy yourselves" to Neil and Ian as they left. Only half a dozen remained now, finishing their drinks. The 2 boys would reply politely, not knowing what else to say. The back door behind the bar opened, and 2 young girls came through into the bar. They were in their late teens, probably twins by the look of them. Yes, definitely twins. They came out and positioned themselves uncomfortably near Ian and Neil. "Ah, I seen you have met my daughters. They will show you to your rooms. Annie, Mary, say hello." Both the girls gave a shy look and quietly offered their greeting. Ian was sure that they had said "my lords," and the end of the muttered greeting. "Rooms?" he asked. Though the beer was flowing freely, he remained strangely sober. "I thought we were sharing?" Even Neil, in his slightly inebriated state, mentally pulled himself together at that point. "Oh, you will be," said the master of the house. The 2 girls led the 2 young lads out to the back of the inn and up the only flight of stairs. Annie stopped outside a door. "This is your room, sir," she said, looking at Ian. "If this is my room, then who am I sharing with?" "Why, with me, sir." Ian's eyebrows raised as high as his forehead would allow. The look of shock which he gave to Neil soon changed to a beatific smile. Mary was standing at the next door along. "And you're in here, with me, sir." She gestured to Neil. The 2 flimsy doors closed as the 2 couples disappeared into the rooms. In the bar, the landlord drank a mug of beer, while his wife cleared the tables. "That's 2 new sources of breeding into the village. We have to take whatever we can when it comes along." The line of trees was on a slight incline and bent round to the right. It had been hard work for the 2 old men, but they knew that they had to get to the top. Their goal was close at hand. Both of the 60-year-olds were becoming increasingly out of breath. A hint of excitement spurred them on. Neither of them had mentioned the pub where they stopped 40 years ago. Somehow, though they knew each other was thinking about it. When they had arranged this walk, they both had firmly in their minds why they wanted to do it. Both of them were wheezing like a grampus when they made it to the top. They looked around. There was no sign of the pub. There was a building, but that was a camping hut used by the Scouts. The purple logo gave that away. A fire had been burning recently. Its charred remains lay in a clearing in amongst the trees. "It was here," said Ian in disbelief. "It can't have been." "It must have. I don't think I'll ever forget that morning." Neil looked around. "Look at the trees. They're too old to have grown in 40 years. It takes a couple of 100 years to grow this big." "So where was it then?" "I don't know. I thought it was here as well. I must have been here." Disappointment was in Ian's voice. "Come on, Welton is just down the hill. We'll go and have a pint in the Green Dragon." Both men set off once again. "At least it's downhill from here." Neil tried to cheer his old friend up. The thought of going for a well-earned pint did that alone. Neil woke early the next morning. Light was shining through the hole in the outside wall. It was a hole, not a window. No glass protected the interior from the elements. The bed he woke up in was uncomfortable, hard and itchy. Still lying next to him lay Mary. He remembered the previous night. He had drank much, but still could remember. How strange it was, the landlord giving his daughters to them. What was the catch? Getting out of bed, he walked over to the window. He could see the river and the patchwork of fields growing all manner of various grains. One thing puzzled him. He was sure a telegraph pole was in the field at the bottom of the valley. Now in daylight, even though the sun had not yet made it above the horizon, he could see the room clearly now. The previous night it had been illuminated by candlelight only, on of them still burnt. What a state it was in. It was no more than a barn. Suddenly he froze to the spot. He could hear someone outside in the corridor. 2 pints of bitters sat on a circular table in the Green Dragon pub. Behind each glass sat a melancholy man. Both remained silent for several minutes, both thinking of the night in that pub 40 years earlier. "Are you all right, gents?" asked the landlord as he passed. "Nothing wrong with the beer, I hope?" No, the beer's fine," replied Neil. "We've lost something," Ian said to him. "Oh yes, and what's that?" asked the middle-aged innkeeper, sitting down on a stool next to the table. Neil decided to take up the tale. "About 40 years ago we walked the Wolds Way. When we were up at Melton Top we stopped at the pub for the night. The landlord was, most accommodating." "On Melton Top?" asked the curious landlord. "Yes," Ian said sharply as he entered the conversation. It sounded to him that the landlord didn't wholly believe them. "It can't have been on Melton Top." "It was, I can assure of that. I realize it was many years ago, but it was there." "Hold on," said the landlord. "I've got a very good book about the village upstairs. I'll go and get it. Keep an eye on the bar for me." He left them alone for a while. There was no need to worry about the bar. They were the only two customers in the pub that afternoon. Neil stood like a statue trying to make out what was being said outside in the corridor. The voices were muffled, but after a short while he began to get the gist of the conversation. It was the landlord's voice that was the most prevalent. Did they both receive? The other voice he presumed was his wife's. It was low, and he wasn't able to make out anything recognizable. Did you actually see them being seated? My God, she must have been watching. The door was riddled with cracks. What kind of sick voyeurs were they? So if they did, then they are ours. It's only 10 minutes until sunrise, then they'll never leave. Once the sun comes up we will be back home. What the hell was going on here? He knew they had to get out now. It was a shame to leave the soup and young women there in the bed. Last night, what he could remember of it was fantastic. He had to warn Ian. He couldn't go out into the corridor. The freak show were out there. He and Ian had both been members of the Sea Scouts in their youth. This would stand them in good stead now. He only hoped that Ian had retained his knowledge of Morse code. Knocking on the adjoining wall between their rooms, he tapped out a warning. Danger, must leave now. Yes, he had heard. A reply came back. Get lost, going for another one. Come on, Ian. Danger, danger, must leave now. The door of his bedroom opened. He held his breath. Ian came in. We've got to get out of here. I heard them talking. They're going to keep us here for their daughters. Get what you can carry. Okay. Ian had never seen Neil be so serious in his life. He knew something was wrong. Ian returned to his room and dressed himself. He looked at the bed. Would it be that bad to stay here with her? Come on. Neil's whispered voice came from outside the room. Ian tiptoed out of his room. As he did, so Annie opened an eye and saw him leaving. Father. She screamed at the top of her voice. Hell. Neil said as the landlord appeared at the end of the corridor, a pitchfork in his hands. Where do you think you're going? He growled. Run. Shouted Ian. Run where the only exit was down the stairs, and that was being blocked by a madman with a pitchfork. There was only one direction to go, and that was back into Neil's room. Mary was sitting up in bed wearing an old nightdress. The raised voices had woken her. She looked at the window and said only one word, quickly. The boys knew what they had to do. Ian jumped out of the window. Neil turned to Mary. Come with us. He offered. I can't. It would be pointless. Go. She had saved them, but why? With a last look round, he jumped out of the window, knocking the candle over as he did so. The dry straw on the floor instantly set alight. Mary sat in the bed and watched as the flames went higher, the wood frames bursting into flames in seconds. The two young men picked themselves up and ran. As they passed the front of the tavern, Ian noticed the sign above the door, The Crusader. As they ran down the footpath from behind him, the voice of the landlord was unmistakable. He was closing in on them. You two, come back, come back. That was not the only sound drifting through the morning air. The sound of screaming too could be heard, two girls' screams as they burned to death. The sun appeared over the horizon, blinding Ian and Neil as they ran for dear life. The voice calling after them stopped the moment the sunrise came, as did the screams. They didn't look back or stop running until they reached the foreshore at North Ferriby. Both of them were partly dressed, such was the manner of their escape. Ian bare his chest, Neil was shoeless, but both were now safe. We, panted Ian, we, never go back there again. Agreed. What was that screaming, and why did the landlord give up the chase so suddenly? I think there are some things we should never ask or talk about again, Ian. In that moment a silent pact was made. As the landlord came back into the bar of the Green Dragon, he could see two empty glasses on the table. Ian and Neil had finished their drinks. The landlord was eager to show the two old gents the results of his findings, but business came first. 2 more pints, gents? Both of them nodded agreement. He brought the drinks over to the table before returning to the bar to collect his book. This book is about all this area. If it's not in here, then no one knows. The two customers drank their pints as he looked through the volume. Ah, here we are. The Crusader. The name sent a chill up Ian's spine. That was the name of the pub. He had forgotten that. His face turned a ghostly shade of white. He felt sick. That's it, he said in a low tone. I can't see how, continued the landlord. It says here that it burned down. Over the years, locals who have been out walking up in Scoutwood, that's up at Melton Top, on Midsummer's Day morning, have reported hearing the screams of the landlord's daughters who were killed in the blaze. That's it, said Neil quietly, now his face also a pale shade. Those 2 poor girls died in a fire. He remembered the screams they had heard running down that hill. That's where we stayed, all right. I doubt it, said the landlord. It burned down in 1648, 400 years ago. Silently, Ian and Neil walked away from the public house. Each knew what the other was thinking, but remained silent. They were lost in their memories of those 2 girls they had spent their last night with. Their quiet contemplation was broken by the landlord of the pub calling after them. They turned to see him holding Ian's walking stick in his hands. "I'd forget my head some days, you know." Ian jokes. It lifted the melancholy atmosphere which had befallen the two men. As they turned, the breeze, which had been blowing that day, dropped and all was still. Now the landlord's voice could be heard a little more clearly. "You two, come back. You've forgotten your stick. Come back, come back." The end.